This is lesson 18.5, Medical Practice. How did the practice of medicine evolve in the 18th century? Well, we've still got College Board Topic 4.1, Contextualizing the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment. Explain the context in which the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment developed in Europe. The experiences of everyday life were shaped by demographic, environmental, medical, and technological changes. We've also got topic 4.4, 18th century society and demographics. Explain the factors contributing to and the consequences of demographic changes from 1648 to 1815. And look at this one at the bottom. We've seen the one at the top, but this one at the bottom. In the 18th century, plague disappeared as a major epidemic disease, and inoculation reduced smallpox mortality. Places: England and the Ottoman Empire, actually. And our time frame is about 1722 to 1798. Key concepts and people of the medical practice. You have smallpox, vaccine, Edward Jenner, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, and cowpox. Intro. The Enlightenment of the 18th century is not generally known for its medical advances. However, that's not quite the whole story. The Enlightenment produced a huge amount of natural and medical research and experimentation, and these efforts led the way to the truly dramatic medical advances of the 19th century. People who practiced medicine also increased greatly during the 18th century, but their methods did not advance very much. Four kinds of practitioners generally took care of the sick: apothecaries, physicians, surgeons, and midwives. And midwives had the least amount of access to formal medical training. It was in the economic interests of physicians, men, to discredit midwives and move in on their traditional domains. Medicine in the 18th century was highly commercialized and completely unregulated, and medical practitioners could say just about anything they wanted to in terms of claims and advertising. Faith healing and general practice. Let's talk about faith healers. Faith healers were basically exorcists. They and their patients believed that patients were ill because evil spirits and demons were inhabiting their bodies. It was the faith healer's job to drive these evil spirits out. Both religious and secular officials tried to stop the activities of faith healers during the 18th century. However, they did not have much success. Apothecaries were experiencing a genuine boom in the 18th century. Apothecaries tended to operate in the larger towns and cities where faith healing was less popular. And the spice trade from Asia was bringing in all kinds of spices with medicinal properties. And botanists who traveled to the New World were bringing to Europe all kinds of medicinal plants and herbs. And these included opium and cinchona, which would yield quinine. Botanists often learned how to use these from native peoples. And England's import of medicinal plants increased 50 to 100 times between 1600 and 1800. Physicians were almost always men. They apprenticed in their teens, then they did hospital work or went to the university. Training was very expensive, and so physicians therefore tended to come from prosperous families. They tended to treat other prosperous people, and they tended to treat urban people. Physicians were socially held up as, quote, gentlemen. They tended not to work with their hands, and they often diagnosed and treated through correspondence or dialogue. They often did not conduct a physical examination. Many still believed in Galen's four humors, remember those? And they still did purgings and bloodlettings. And increasingly, physicians were experimenting with new methods. Surgeons made great advances in the 18th century. Unfortunately, the many battlefields of the 18th century gave surgeons lots of opportunity to practice. And they learned how to save the lives of soldiers with shattered limbs by sawing them off and cauterizing the remaining stumps. They operated without painkillers, they operated without antiseptic, there was no germ theory yet, and many patients died of infection even with minor wounds. Midwives. They did much more than just deliver babies. They also treated female problems, they treated reproduction problems, they treated small children, and midwives were often regulated by a local guild. The invention of forceps in 1734 was bad news for midwives. Forceps and other medical instruments were things only male physicians had access to, and these physicians now had a pathway for cutting into the business of midwives. They created the narrative that midwives were ignorant and dangerous. Statistically, midwives did not lose any more babies than physicians. Women practitioners actively campaigned to protect their professions from attack. Madame du Coudray was an example. She wrote a book in 1757 called Manual on the Art of Childbirth. She traveled all over France teaching birthing techniques, and she used life-size models in her demonstrations. The conquest of smallpox. There are actually two stories about the conquest of smallpox rather than just one, and it's easy to get the two of them confused. As we know, by the 1720s, the plague had all but disappeared in Europe, leaving smallpox as the number one infectious disease. Smallpox killed about 60 million Europeans during the 18th century. It could leave survivors horribly disfigured and blinded. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. She was an English aristocrat. Her husband was the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. She learned how Muslims were inoculating people against smallpox in Western Asia. This was not an actual vaccine like the stories often tell. They were using the pus from actual smallpox victims, and this was risky. It made you sick for a while, and an inoculated person could still spread the disease. But Lady Montagu successfully inoculated her son, and she took the practice back to England. Edward Jenner, 1749 to 1823. Edward Jenner was an English country doctor, and in his practice, he met lots of milkmaids who had contracted cowpox. Cowpox produced nasty sores similar to those produced by smallpox. However, cowpox was a much milder disease than smallpox. Cowpox was also not contagious like smallpox. You could only get it from a cow, you couldn't get it from another person. Jenner noticed that these milkmaids never got smallpox. Could it be that cowpox somehow protected you from smallpox? And if so, was there a way that you could transmit cowpox from one person to another in order to keep another person from getting smallpox? Jenner did 18 years of research collecting data on the idea. And in 1796, he found a milkmaid named Sarah Nelms who had fresh cowpox lesions on her arms and hands. And Jenner took some pus from her lesions and scratched it into the skin of an 8-year-old boy named James Phipps. The kid got mildly ill but recovered very quickly. 9 days later, Jenner scratched actual smallpox into the boy. Now, usually that would make you sick for a while, but the boy did not get sick at all. The cowpox from Sarah Nelms inoculated him against smallpox. Edward Jenner published his findings in 1798, and soon smallpox was eradicated from Europe. Today, it exists nowhere in the world, and the word vaccine comes from the Latin word vacca, which means cow.